So I'm Megan. My co-author, Randall, is also on this paper. So this is kind of following up what he just presented using a different sample. So he compared two probability-based panels, and in the study I'll be comparing an ABS sample with a probability-based panel and an opt-in and trying to combine those. So I won't spend too much time on the intro since he already talked about most of it. Obviously, we have a probability-based sample and then an opt-in sample. And in general, opt-in samples have been found to be less accurate and have more bias than probability-based samples, especially when looking at, generally when looking at national samples of adults. So this study will be using the Ipsos Knowledge Panel, which is one of the largest probability-based panels with over 60,000 active members. So it is a large panel, but often when clients are interested in looking at smaller subgroups of population, so smaller demographic groups or smaller geographic groups, we have to supplement our sample with opt-in sample in order to achieve their sample size that they want. So this is often true of subnational estimates, which is what this study will be about. So we can often see problems in opt-in samples, especially when looking at these smaller geographies. So we often introduce quotas to try to counteract the lower quality and the bias in opt-in samples, hoping that the demographic composition, controlling that will bring more accurate results. So the study that I will be presenting on here is one that we conducted in 2022 during the midterm election in Wisconsin. So we fielded 3 different sample sources. One was an address-based sample where we primarily used a mail-back survey. And then we had 2 online panel samples. So we had one from the knowledge panel, probability-based, and then we also had an opt-in sample. So we were trying to see if we could replicate the results of the opt-in sample having higher bias than probability-based when also looking at subnational estimates and not just national. We also wanted to look at the blending methods. So we used the same blending methods that Randall just talked about. So using the pooling the samples without regard to their effective sample sizes and then combining them based on their relative effective sample sizes. And so first we pooled the 2 probability-based samples together to see if maybe they might have different directions of bias. So maybe combining them could reduce the overall bias. And then next we also added in the opt-in sample to see if that extra sample size would increase or decrease the bias. So a little bit more about the study that we did. So the ABS study was 93% mail-back response. We had 7% online, and then the KP and opt-in were obviously online only. So we had about 1,600 completes in the ABS, and then almost 1,000 in KP, and then almost 2,000 for the opt-in. So the opt-in sample was larger than both of the probability-based samples. So for the ABS sample, we had 4 mailings. We started with an invitation letter with a mail-back survey, sent a postcard reminder, then sent a reminder letter which first introduced that online option, and then a final postcard reminder. For the knowledge panel, we used our standard methodology. Won't get too much into that. For the opt-in, we primarily used our ISAY panel, which is a panel of opt-in participants where we verify their physical addresses. And then we had some additional opt-in sample, but we used panel-only samples since panels have been opt-in panels show slightly better results than like river samples of opt-in. We also had minimum quotas based on age, gender, education, and race ethnicity. So it's important to note for some of the results that we'll find. So we had a variety of benchmarks. So this slide shows the general benchmarks that were in our survey. So they ranged from kind of low prevalence to high prevalence, a bunch of different topics. So at the time, COVID vaccination was a big thing to estimate. So we had getting at least 1 dose of a COVID vaccine. We also had being married, having a valid US passport, having a motorcycle. So there's quite a few different things that we then pulled the benchmarks from state level surveys. And then we also had 3 politically related benchmarks. So the being currently registered to vote in Wisconsin, as well as voting Republican for senator or governor in the 2022 midterm election. So for weighting, we weighted by age by gender, race, ethnicity, education, income, and then region of state and urbanicity for the probability samples, but we didn't have those variables available for opt-in. So you can see for the opt-in, most of the weighting variables matched the quotas that we used. So then when we go to weight, so this slide shows our descriptives of the weights. You can see the efficiencies, the second from the last column. The two probability-based samples had lower efficiencies because they weren't using quotas. And so the quotas for the opt-in kind of artificially inflate the efficiency since you don't have to weight quite as much since the quotas already did that for you. So the two probability samples had lower efficiencies. And so these are the three separate weights, and then the two weights shown there are the ones combined by the effective sample sizes. So going on to the results, this is just here for reference. I'm not going to try to get you to look at this slide. So here are the summary of that. So similar to what Randall showed, those were the benchmarks for each of the different samples, and then the benchmark, the Wisconsin benchmark as well. And so we looked at the average absolute difference between the sample and the benchmarks for both unweighted and weighted data. So as you can see, the ABS had the lowest bias when looking at unweighted, and KP and opt-in had similar levels of bias unweighted, but then once you weight them, the demographic weights are able to bring down the bias in KP to similar levels as ABS, but it's not able to reduce the bias for opt-in quite as much. So you see that the demographic weighting helps probability more than it does opt-in. So next we looked at combining the samples. So like Randall mentioned, we used a pooled weight where we just combined them based on their total sample sizes, not considering their effective sample size. And then the second weight was based on the effective sample sizes or their weighting efficiencies. So first we look at the two probability samples together and then the opt-in. So again, this just shows the estimates for the different samples combinations if you are interested in looking at these later. But here are the overall results. So we combined these with the combined samples. So these are the combined bias from the benchmarks. So it shows the unweighted. The first is the ABS and KP, and then the second set includes the opt-in. And here you can see that weighting by demographics reduced the bias for all of these combinations, similar to the separate ones. So when you look at the ABS and KP combination, you can't see it in reference to the individual samples from the previous slide, but the bias does get reduced slightly by combining the two samples together. But then once you add in the opt-in, it does get very slightly higher. So you can see that if you look at like the pooled weighted or the ESS weighted columns, the ABS and KP is just slightly biased or less biased than when you add in the opt-in. And then looking at the pooled weight versus the ESS weight, so we were a bit surprised to see that it doesn't seem to make that much of a difference. And actually here, once you add in the opt-in, the ESS weight is just slightly more biased by very like 0.2. And so this is likely because of the weighting efficiency for the opt-in sample, since the efficiency was so much higher because of the quotas that we used, and the sample was also 2,000 versus the smaller probability-based samples. It contributed more towards this combined sample. So in conclusion, the probability-based samples did have lower bias than the opt-in sample, especially after weighting on demographics. So the demographic weighting was able to reduce the bias in the probability panel, but not in the opt-in. And blending the probability-based samples together did lower the bias somewhat, but then once you add in the opt-in sample, it slightly increased the bias. And in contrast to kind of what we expected, the results for the ESS weight were actually slightly more biased than the pooled weight. And like we've said, that contributes, or that suggests that there's three main factors that are influencing these weights, this ESS weighting method, is that we have a more biased sample, the opt-in sample, which is has more participants and results in a larger effective sample size. So it contributes more towards these combined weights. So in conclusion, I don't think we think either of these methods are necessarily the best possible methods for blending. We don't currently know of a method that would lead to significantly lower bias for a combined sample overall. Thank you.